My daughter-in-law thought she had won the moment I signed everything over to her, I said quietly, watching her reflection in the polished surface of the dining table. But she never understood what I was really giving her. I didn't raise my voice when I said it. I didn't need to. Olivia was too busy smiling, too busy basking in what she believed was her victory, to notice the weight behind my words. The house still smelled faintly of lilies from my husband's funeral 3 days ago, their sweetness turning stale in the warm spring air that drifted through the open windows. At 68, I had buried the man I spent 42 years building a life with, and somehow the silence that followed wasn't the hardest part. It was the way everything shifted after. The way my son stopped looking at me directly, as if eye contact required something he no longer had. The way Olivia moved through my home like she was already rearranging it in her mind, deciding what would stay and what would go. I noticed everything, even though I pretended not to. That was the first mistake they made. They thought grief had made me weak. They thought loss had made me careless. The morning after the funeral, I found Olivia in the kitchen, standing exactly where I used to stand every Sunday for decades, her fingers tapping against the marble countertop as she spoke in a low voice on the phone. She didn't see me at first. "Yes, it should be finalized soon," she said, her tone calm and efficient, nothing like the soft condolences she had offered me just hours earlier in front of guests. "Once everything is transferred, we can move forward." She paused listening, then added, "No, she won't be a problem." I stepped back before she could turn around, my hand tightening slightly on the hallway wall to steady myself. Not a problem. That was what I had become. Not a mother. Not the woman who held this family together for decades. Just an obstacle that needed to be managed. Later that afternoon, Daniel sat across from me in the living room, his posture stiff, his words carefully chosen like he was reading from a script. "Mom," he began, not quite meeting my eyes, "we've been thinking about what's best moving forward. For you. For all of us." I folded my hands in my lap and waited. Silence has a way of making people reveal more than they intend. "The house is a lot to handle," he continued. "Maintenance, property taxes, everything. Olivia and I could take care of it. Make things easier for you." Easier. That word lingered in the air between us, polished and hollow. I nodded slowly, as if considering it for the first time, even though I had already heard enough to understand exactly what they wanted. Not help. Control. Ownership. Everything my husband and I had built reduced to a convenient solution. "If that's what you think is best," I said gently. I watched the relief flicker across his face, quick and undeniable. Olivia, standing just behind him, didn't bother hiding hers at all. That was the moment I knew. Not just what they wanted, but how far they were willing to go to get it. That night, I sat alone in my bedroom, the same room where my husband had taken his last breath, and stared at the stack of documents their lawyer had left on my desk earlier that day. Transfer forms. Authorization papers. Signatures waiting to be filled in. It would have been easy to refuse. To argue. To demand explanations. But I had learned something over the years, something they had clearly forgotten. Power doesn't always come from resistance. Sometimes it comes from agreement. I picked up the pen slowly, feeling its familiar weight between my fingers, and allowed myself a small, quiet smile. If they wanted everything, I would give it to them. Every last piece. But I would give it on my terms. The next morning, I called Mr. Harrison Cole, the attorney who had worked with my husband for over 20 years. His voice was steady as ever when he answered, but there was a pause when I told him I was ready to move forward. "Are you certain, Mrs. Whitmore?" he asked carefully. "This is a significant decision." I glanced toward the window, where the early sunlight stretched across the garden my husband had planted with his own hands. Roses were beginning to bloom, their red petals opening slowly, deliberately. "Yes," I said. "I'm certain." There was another pause, longer this time, and I could almost hear the unspoken questions forming on the other end of the line. "Then I'll prepare the documents," he replied finally. "There may be certain provisions we should discuss." I let the silence linger for just a moment before answering. "Yes," I said softly. "There is one thing I'd like to add." When Olivia returned that afternoon, I was sitting at the dining table with the papers neatly arranged in front of me, the pen resting exactly where she could see it. She smiled the moment she noticed, her expression bright, almost triumphant. "You've made a decision," she said, stepping closer. I looked up at her, calm and composed, and nodded. "I have." Daniel joined us minutes later. His movements quick, eager, like a man trying not to appear eager. They sat across from me, side by side, their hands brushing lightly against each other as if sharing a silent victory. I didn't rush. I reviewed each page slowly, deliberately, letting the seconds stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable. Then, without hesitation, I signed. One page after another. My name written clearly, steadily, exactly where they wanted it. Olivia exhaled softly, a sound she probably didn't realize she made. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, the tension leaving his shoulders all at once. To them it was done. Finished. Over. I set the pen down and folded my hands neatly in front of me. "There," I said. "You have everything you asked for." Olivia's smile widened, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "Thank you, Margaret," she replied, her tone smooth, practiced. "This really is for the best." I held her gaze for a moment, just long enough for something unspoken to pass between us. Then I gave a small nod. "Yes," I said quietly. "It is." And for the first time since my husband's passing, I felt something settle deep within me. Not grief, not anger, something colder, something clearer. They thought they had taken everything from me. They thought I had nothing left to protect. But as I looked at the signatures drying on those pages, I knew the truth they hadn't yet discovered. I hadn't lost control. I had just changed the rules. 2 days passed and the rhythm of the house continued to shift in ways that were subtle to anyone who did not know it as I did, but unmistakable to me. I began to notice how quickly decisions were being made now, how little space there was between suggestion and action. Olivia no longer asked where things belonged. She decided. The silverware was moved. The china I had carefully collected over decades was boxed and placed in the back of a cabinet, replaced with something newer, simpler, something that held no history. Daniel did not question it. He adapted. That was always his way. I watched from a distance, not as a victim, but as someone observing a pattern finally revealing itself without disguise. That morning I received a call from Mr. Harrison Cole. His voice was measured, but there was a weight beneath it that had not been there before. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I have reviewed the final documents again, including the additional clause you requested." I stepped into the hallway, closing the door gently behind me to keep the conversation private. "And?" I asked, my tone steady. There was a brief pause. "It is precisely worded," he replied. "Clear. Enforceable. There will be no room for interpretation." I allowed myself a small breath, not of relief but of confirmation. "Good," I said. "That is what I intended." He hesitated for a moment longer before continuing. "They have already contacted my office this morning," he added. "They wanted to confirm the date of the formal reading." I could picture it without needing details. Olivia sitting upright, composed, asking the right questions with practiced ease. Daniel beside her, nodding, trusting. "Set it for Friday," I said. "Late morning." "Very well," he replied. 11 o'clock. When I returned to the kitchen, Olivia was standing at the counter, her phone pressed to her ear, her voice low but sharp with excitement she could not quite conceal. She ended the call as soon as she saw me and offered a smile that felt almost rehearsed. "Everything is moving quickly," she said. I nodded. "It usually does, once people are certain of what they want." She held my gaze for a moment, searching for something, perhaps doubt, perhaps resistance. She found neither. That afternoon I decided to take a walk through the neighborhood, something I had not done since before the funeral. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass, and the sidewalk stretched out in familiar lines that had not changed, even if everything else had. I passed by houses where families moved through their own quiet routines, unaware of the careful unraveling taking place in mine. For a moment I considered how easily I could have been one of them, how easily this could have remained a life of simple expectations and quiet trust. But that version of the story no longer existed. By the time I returned home, Daniel was in the living room reviewing something on his laptop, his brow slightly furrowed in concentration. Olivia sat beside him, leaning in just enough to suggest partnership, her hand resting lightly on the arm of the chair. They looked up when I entered, their expressions shifting almost instantly into something more neutral, more controlled. "We were just going over a few plans," Daniel said. "For after Friday." "After Friday." He said it with certainty, as if the outcome had already been sealed, as if the future had already been assigned. I set my purse down on the table and met his eyes. "It is good to plan ahead," I replied. Olivia smiled, but there was something sharper behind it now, something more impatient. "We just want to make sure everything transitions smoothly," she added. I nodded slowly. "Of course." That evening I found myself standing once again in the dining room, my fingers tracing lightly along the edge of the table where so many conversations had taken place over the years. Birthdays, holidays, ordinary evenings that had once felt permanent simply because they were repeated often enough. I could almost hear the echoes of those moments if I stood still long enough. But memory has a way of fading when it is no longer honored. I pulled out a chair and sat down, letting the silence settle around me. In just a few days, this room would hold a different kind of gathering. Not one built on warmth or familiarity, but on expectation, on certainty, on the quiet belief that everything had already been decided. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, not in sadness but in clarity. They had already begun to reshape the space around them, to redefine what this house meant, who it belonged to, and what it would become. They believed ownership had already shifted. They believed the story was nearing its end. But what they did not understand was that the most important part had not even been spoken yet. It was waiting, patient, precise. And when it arrived, it would not announce itself with noise or conflict. It would arrive the way truth often does, quietly, in a single moment that cannot be undone. Friday arrived with a kind of stillness that felt deliberate, as if the house itself understood that something final was about to unfold. I woke earlier than usual, long before the sun had fully risen, and sat by the window watching the light slowly gather across the garden. The roses were in full bloom now, their color deeper, more certain, untouched by anything that had changed inside these walls. For a moment, I allowed myself to remember how my husband used to stand beside me at this same window, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder, his voice low as he spoke about plans that stretched far beyond a single season. He had always believed in building something that would last. I wondered briefly what he would have said if he had seen how quickly that belief had been tested. By 9 o'clock, the house had already begun to shift into performance. Olivia moved through each room with careful attention, adjusting small details that most people would never notice. A chair angled slightly differently, a vase repositioned, the kind of changes that were not about comfort but about control. Daniel dressed more formally than usual, his shirt pressed, his posture straighter, as if he were preparing for something important, something that required him to appear certain. They spoke less that morning, their conversations reduced to brief exchanges, their focus directed entirely toward what was coming next. I remained quiet, moving through my own routine without interruption, each action measured, each step deliberate. At 10:30, Mr. Harrison Cole arrived. He entered with the same composed demeanor he had carried for as long as I had known him, his presence steady, grounded, unaffected by the tension that lingered just beneath the surface of the room. He greeted each of us politely, his tone even, his expression unreadable. When his eyes met mine, there was a brief pause, a flicker of understanding that required no words. Everything had been prepared exactly as we had discussed. We gathered in the dining room shortly before 11. The table was clear, the documents neatly arranged at one end, their edges aligned with precise care. Daniel and Olivia sat side by side, their chairs slightly closer together than usual, their posture attentive, expectant. I took my seat across from them, folding my hands lightly in my lap, my gaze steady. Mr. Cole remained standing for a moment before sitting at the head of the table, opening his folder with a quiet, deliberate motion. The room settled into silence, the kind that carries weight, the kind that makes every small sound feel amplified. The ticking of the clock on the wall, the faint rustle of paper as he turned the first page, the soft intake of breath from Olivia as she leaned forward slightly, her focus sharpened by anticipation. "We are here to formally review the finalized estate documents," Mr. Cole began, his voice calm, measured, carrying easily across the room. He proceeded carefully, outlining each section with clarity, his words precise, leaving no space for confusion. Property allocations, financial accounts, transfers of ownership. Each detail unfolded exactly as Daniel and Olivia had expected, each line confirming what they believed had already been secured. I watched them as he spoke, the way Daniel's shoulders gradually relaxed, the way Olivia's expression softened into quiet satisfaction, her confidence growing with each passing moment. They did not interrupt. They did not question. There was no need. Everything was aligning perfectly with their expectations. When Mr. Cole reached the final pages, there was a subtle shift in the air, something almost imperceptible, like the pause before a door closes. He adjusted the paper slightly, his gaze lowering to the text in front of him, his tone remaining steady. "There is one final provision that must be acknowledged," he said. Olivia leaned forward just a fraction more, her attention sharpening, her interest immediate. Daniel glanced briefly at her, then back at the documents, his expression still calm, still certain. I did not move. I did not speak. I simply waited, my hands resting lightly against one another, my breathing slow and even. In that moment the room felt suspended, as if time itself had chosen to pause, to hold everything in place just long enough for what was about to be said to settle with its full weight. Mr. Cole's voice remained calm as he continued, his words measured, deliberate, each one placed exactly where it needed to be. And as he began to read that final sentence, I allowed myself the smallest, quietest smile, one that no one else in the room seemed to notice, but one that carried everything they had failed to understand. To inherit any portion of the estate, each named beneficiary must provide documented proof of consistent financial support and personal care for a continuous period of no less than 12 months prior to the date of execution. Mr. Cole read, his voice steady, each word landing with quiet precision in the stillness of the room. For a moment no one moved. The sentence did not sound dramatic. It did not need to. Its weight was not in how it was spoken but in what it required. Olivia blinked once, slowly, as if her mind needed a second to catch up with what she had just heard. Daniel's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, his shoulders tightening instead of relaxing, his fingers pressing lightly against the edge of the table. "I am sorry," Olivia said after a brief pause, her voice controlled but edged with something sharper now. "Could you clarify what that means exactly?" Mr. Cole did not look up immediately. He allowed the silence to linger just long enough to make the question feel unnecessary before answering. "It means," he said calmly, "that eligibility to retain the transferred assets is conditional upon verifiable records demonstrating ongoing financial contribution and personal caregiving support to Mrs. Whitmore. Over the past 12 months. Olivia's expression changed then, not dramatically, but enough. The confidence that had settled so comfortably in her features moments earlier began to fracture, replaced by something more cautious, more calculating. "There must be some mistake," she replied, her tone tightening despite her effort to keep it composed. "We have been here. We have been involved." Daniel nodded quickly beside her, his agreement immediate, almost reflexive. "Yes, we have been helping," he added. "We have always been around." I said nothing. I simply watched them, my hands still folded neatly in my lap, my breathing even, my gaze steady. Mr. Cole adjusted the papers slightly, his movements unhurried. "Presence," he said, "is not the same as documented support. The clause specifies both financial contribution and consistent personal care, supported by verifiable records, bank statements, medical logs, signed documentation." Olivia leaned back in her chair, her posture stiffening as she processed the implication. "That is unreasonable," she said, the edge in her voice no longer fully concealed. "No one keeps records like that for family." Mr. Cole finally looked up, meeting her gaze with calm professionalism. "Some do," he replied simply. Daniel glanced at Olivia, then back at the documents, his expression shifting from confusion to something closer to realization. "Mom," he said, turning toward me, his voice softer now, searching. "You knew about this?" I met his eyes without hesitation. "I approved it," I said quietly. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence carried a different kind of weight. It was no longer anticipation. It was recognition. Olivia's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the tension beneath it. "This is not what we agreed to," she said, her voice lower, more controlled but unmistakably strained. I tilted my head slightly, considering her words as if they required thought. "You agreed to the documents," I replied. "All of them." Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, his earlier certainty unraveling in small visible ways. "There has to be something we can do," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. Mr. Cole closed the folder in front of him with a soft, deliberate motion. "The terms are clear," he said. "Without the required documentation, the conditions for inheritance are not met." Olivia's gaze sharpened, her mind already searching for alternatives, for arguments, for any detail she might have overlooked. "And if the conditions are not met?" she asked. Mr. Cole's expression did not change. "Then the assets are redistributed according to the secondary provisions outlined in the estate plan." There it was. The part they had not asked about. The part they had not cared to read. I watched as the realization settled in, not all at once but in layers. Olivia's confidence giving way to calculation. Daniel's certainty replaced by doubt. The room, which had felt so controlled just moments before, now held a different kind of stillness, one shaped not by expectation, but by the slow understanding that something fundamental had shifted. I unfolded my hands and placed them gently on the table, the movement small, but enough to draw their attention back to me. "You wanted everything," I said, my voice calm, steady, without anger or accusation. I paused for just a moment, allowing the words to settle before continuing. "I made sure you would have the chance to earn it." Neither of them responded immediately. There was nothing left to say that would change what had already been set in motion. Outside, the afternoon light continued to move across the garden, unchanged, uninterrupted. Inside, the rules they thought they understood had already been rewritten, and for the first time since this began, I could see it clearly in their eyes. They had not lost everything yet, but they were beginning to understand that they might. The silence that followed did not break all at once. It stretched, thin and fragile, as if any sudden movement might shatter what little composure remained in the room. Olivia was the first to shift. She straightened in her chair, her fingers smoothing the edge of the document in front of her, a small gesture that might have looked controlled to anyone who did not know what to look for. But I saw it. The tension in her hands, the calculation behind her eyes. She was already searching for a way out. "This clause," she began carefully, her voice measured again, "it seems open to interpretation. What qualifies as care can vary. Emotional support, presence, time spent." Mr. Cole did not interrupt her. He let her finish, then folded his hands over the closed folder in front of him. "The language is specific," he replied. "It requires documented evidence, financial contributions, recorded assistance, verified support." Olivia held his gaze, her expression tightening just slightly. "And if documentation can be provided now?" she asked. Daniel turned toward her quickly, as if surprised by the direction she was taking, but he said nothing. Mr. Cole shook his head once, a small, definitive movement. "The clause clearly states that the support must have been consistent over the previous 12 months. It cannot be created after the fact." That was the moment it settled fully. Not just the words but the finality behind them. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his eyes lowering to the table as if the answers might still be hidden somewhere between the lines. "We did not know," he said quietly, his voice carrying something softer now, something closer to regret than certainty. I watched him for a moment, the familiar shape of his face, the lines that had deepened over the years, the small gestures that still reminded me of the boy he used to be. But memory does not change what stands in front of you. "You did not ask," I replied gently. Olivia exhaled slowly, her composure slipping further as the weight of the situation pressed in. "This is not fair," she said, more directly now, the careful politeness gone. "We stepped in when things needed to be handled. We were here." I tilted my head slightly, considering her words with the same calm I had maintained from the beginning. "You were here when it became necessary," I said. "Not before." She opened her mouth as if to respond, then stopped, her expression tightening as she realized there was no simple way to reshape what had already been defined. The room felt smaller now, the air heavier, the certainty that had once filled it replaced by something far less stable. Mr. Cole remained still, his role complete, his presence now more observational than active. He did not need to say more. Everything that mattered had already been placed on the table. Daniel finally looked up again, his gaze moving between Olivia and me, uncertainty written clearly across his face. "What happens now?" he asked. It was not a challenge. It was a question. A genuine one. I let the silence linger for a moment before answering, not out of hesitation, but out of intention. "Now," I said calmly, "the terms stand as they are." Olivia's posture shifted again, her patience thinning, her control slipping further with each passing second. "So we are just supposed to accept this?" she asked, her voice sharper now. I met her gaze without flinching. "You accepted it when you signed," I replied. The words were simple. They did not need to be anything else. Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering as if the fight had already begun to leave him. Olivia, however, remained still, her eyes focused, her mind still working, still searching. She was not someone who accepted loss easily. I could see it in the way she held herself, in the way she refused to look away. But there are moments when persistence does not change the outcome. This was one of them. Outside, a car passed slowly along the street, the sound faint, distant, a reminder that the world beyond this room continued as it always had. Inside, everything had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to make it irreversible. I rose from my chair then, the movement unhurried, my hands resting briefly against the table before I stepped back. Daniel looked up at me, something uncertain in his expression, something unfinished. Olivia did not move. She remained seated, her gaze fixed forward, her thoughts still turning over what could no longer be undone. I adjusted the sleeve of my jacket, a small, habitual gesture, and allowed myself one last look at the documents spread across the table. They had wanted certainty. They had wanted control. And for a moment they had believed they had both. I turned toward the door, my steps quiet. Against the floor, the room behind me holding the weight of what had just been understood. I did not need to say anything else. The silence was enough. It always had been. The house felt quieter after that, not because there were fewer people in it, but because something had been removed that could not be replaced. Expectation had left the room, and in its place was something heavier, something that lingered in the spaces between words. I walked slowly down the hallway, my hand brushing lightly against the wall as I passed the framed photographs that had not yet been taken down. Faces from years that once felt permanent. Smiles that had not needed effort. I paused briefly in front of one taken nearly 20 years ago. Daniel standing beside me, younger, unguarded, his arm around my shoulder in a way that felt natural back then. I studied it for a moment, then moved on. Some things are meant to be remembered, not restored. Behind me, I could hear the faint murmur of voices from the dining room, low and controlled at first, then sharper as the conversation shifted. Olivia's tone carried more clearly than Daniel's, precise, insistent, her words shaped by frustration she could no longer conceal. Daniel responded more quietly, his voice uneven, as if he were trying to steady something that refused to settle. I did not stop to listen. I did not need to. I already understood how that conversation would unfold. The language would change, but the outcome would not. In the kitchen, I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the sink, looking out at the garden where the afternoon light had begun to soften. The roses moved gently in the breeze, their stems bending without breaking, their color unchanged. There was something in that quiet resilience that felt familiar. For years I had been told that strength meant holding everything together, maintaining peace, making space for others to feel secure. I had believed that. I had lived by it. But standing there, watching the garden carry on without effort, I understood something different. Strength was not always about holding on. Sometimes it was about knowing exactly when to let go. A few minutes later, the voices behind me stopped. The silence that followed was not the same as before. It was heavier, more deliberate, shaped by the realization that nothing they said to each other could alter what had already been set in place. Footsteps approached, slower now, less certain. Daniel appeared in the doorway, his posture slightly lowered, his expression caught somewhere between confusion and something more difficult to name. "Mom," he said, his voice quieter than it had been all day. I turned to face him, my hands resting lightly against the edge of the counter. Yes. He hesitated, the words forming and dissolving before he could speak them fully. I did not know, he said finally, about any of this. I held his gaze steady, unshaken. I know, I replied. It was the truth. But it was not the whole truth. Olivia remained behind him, just out of view, but I could feel her presence in the tension that lingered at the edge of the moment. She did not step forward. She did not speak. For the first time since this began, she understood that control was no longer something she could claim simply by reaching for it. Daniel nodded slowly, as if accepting something he could not yet fully process. He looked around the kitchen, at the cabinets that had been rearranged, at the small changes that had already begun to reshape the space, and for a brief moment something like doubt crossed his face. What happens next? He asked again, more quietly this time. I considered the question not because I needed to think about the answer, but because I wanted him to understand it when I gave it. Now, I said, my voice calm even, we live with the choices that have already been made. He did not respond. There was nothing left for him to say. I turned back toward the window, letting my gaze rest once more on the garden, on the steady rhythm of something that did not depend on anyone's approval to continue. Behind me, I heard his footsteps retreat, slower than before, each one carrying a weight that had not been there when he first entered the room. I remained where I was, still and composed, the quiet settling around me in a way that no longer felt empty. It felt complete. That evening unfolded more slowly than the rest of the day, as if time itself had decided to stretch the distance between what had happened and what would come next. The house no longer carried the same quiet confidence it had just that morning. Something had shifted beneath the surface, something that could not be rearranged or softened by polite conversation. I remained in the kitchen for a while longer, listening not to the silence, but to the absence of certainty that had once filled it. Eventually I heard movement again, this time more deliberate, more controlled. Olivia entered first, her posture composed, her expression carefully neutral, as if she had already decided on a different approach. Daniel followed a few steps behind, quieter, his presence less certain than it had been before. Olivia stopped across from me, resting her hands lightly against the back of a chair, her fingers still, her gaze direct. "We should talk," she said. Her voice had changed. The sharpness was gone, replaced by something smoother, more measured, but no less intentional. I turned slightly to face her, my hands resting calmly against the counter. "We are talking," I replied. She held my gaze, searching again, perhaps for hesitation, perhaps for an opening. "This does not have to be final," she continued. "There are ways to resolve this. Adjustments that can be made." Daniel glanced at her, then at me, as if unsure which direction the conversation would take. I let a small pause settle between us before answering. "The documents are already signed," I said. "The terms are already clear." Olivia's expression did not change, but I could see the effort behind it now, the careful control required to maintain it. "Terms can be revisited," she said, "especially when they create unnecessary complications." I considered her words not because they held weight, but because they revealed exactly what she believed this was. A negotiation. A situation that could be reshaped with the right pressure, the right argument, the right tone. Complications for whom? I asked quietly. That was the first moment she hesitated. It was brief, almost invisible, but it was there. Daniel shifted beside her, his weight moving slightly from one foot to the other, his uncertainty growing more visible with each passing second. "We all want what is best," he said, his voice softer now, less certain than before. I turned my gaze toward him, steady, unhurried. "Do we?" I asked. The question did not require an answer. It was not meant to. Olivia exhaled slowly, her composure tightening again as she adjusted her approach. "You are making this more difficult than it needs to be," she said, the calmness in her voice now edged with something firmer. "We stepped in when things needed to be handled. We are trying to move forward." I nodded slightly, acknowledging her words without agreeing to them. "You are moving forward," I said. "I am simply making sure that the direction is clear." Daniel looked between us again, the tension settling deeper into his posture, His earlier confidence replaced by something closer to restraint. "There has to be a way to fix this," he said almost quietly, as if the words were meant more for himself than for either of us. I watched him for a moment, then shifted my gaze back to Olivia. She stood perfectly still now, her expression composed, her silence more revealing than anything she had said. She was waiting, calculating, deciding whether to press further or step back. "There is nothing to fix," I said finally, my voice calm even. "There is only what was chosen." The words settled between us not as a challenge but as a conclusion. Olivia's fingers tightened slightly against the chair, the only sign that the control she held so carefully was beginning to strain. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she held my gaze for a long moment, as if measuring something that could no longer be measured the way she expected. Then, without another word, she stepped back. It was a small movement, but it carried weight. Daniel hesitated for a second longer before following her, his eyes lingering on me as if searching for something that was no longer there. When they left the room, the silence returned, but it was different now. Not empty, not uncertain. It was settled, defined. I remained where I was, my hands resting lightly against the counter, my gaze drifting once more toward the window where the last light of the day had begun to fade. The garden outside continued as it always had, untouched by negotiation, unchanged by expectation. Inside, the outcome had already been decided, not in that moment but long before it. And for the first time since all of this began, there was nothing left to prepare for, only what would come next. The next morning arrived without urgency, without the tension that had filled the house just a day before, and for the first time in a long while, the quiet felt honest. I woke at the same early hour, but there was no weight pressing against my chest, no anticipation waiting at the edge of the day. The decisions had already been made. The outcome had already begun to settle into place. As I stepped into the hallway, I noticed something subtle but unmistakable. The house no longer felt like it was being rearranged. It felt paused, as if the momentum that had driven every change over the past few days had suddenly stopped. In the kitchen, Daniel was already there, standing by the counter with a cup of coffee in his hands. He looked up when he saw me, his expression quieter than it had been before, the certainty replaced by something more reflective. "Good morning," he said. I nodded. "Good morning." There was a brief silence between us, not uncomfortable but unfamiliar. He seemed as though he wanted to say something more, but the words did not come easily. Finally, he set the cup down and turned toward me fully. "I spoke with Mr. Cole this morning," he said. I waited. "He confirmed everything," Daniel continued, "about the clause, about what it requires." I studied his face, the slight tension around his eyes, the way his voice carried a different weight now. "And?" I asked. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly. "There is nothing we can do about what has already been signed," he said. The words were simple, but they carried a finality that had not been there before. I nodded once. "That is correct." He looked down at the counter for a moment, his fingers resting lightly against the surface, as if grounding himself in something steady. "Olivia is still trying to figure out if there is another option," he added. I allowed a small pause before responding. "She will not find one," I said. It was not said with satisfaction. It was simply the truth. Daniel gave a slight nod, as if he already knew that, as if part of him had accepted it even before he spoke the words aloud. For a moment, neither of us said anything more. The quiet settled between us again, but this time it felt different. Not heavy, not uncertain, just clear. A few minutes later, Olivia entered the kitchen. She moved with the same composed posture she had always carried, but there was something more restrained about it now, something measured in a different way. She glanced at Daniel briefly before turning her attention to me. "I spoke with another attorney," she said without preamble. Her tone was calm, controlled, but there was an edge beneath it, something that had not fully settled. I met her gaze. "And?" I asked. She held my eyes for a moment, then exhaled softly. "He said the same thing," she admitted. The words seemed to settle in the room with a quiet finality. There was no argument left to make, no interpretation left to challenge. just the reality of what had already been put into place. Olivia walked to the counter and set her phone down, her movements slower now, more deliberate. "You were very precise," she said after a moment. It was not a compliment. It was recognition. I inclined my head slightly. "I had time to think," I replied. Daniel shifted beside her, his posture no longer defensive, but no longer certain either. "What happens to everything now?" he asked, his voice steady but quieter than before. I looked at both of them, taking in the difference in their expressions, the absence of the confidence that had once defined this conversation. "The secondary provisions take effect," I said. Olivia's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in focus. "Meaning?" she asked. I held her gaze, my voice calm even. "The estate is transferred according to the conditions outlined beyond the primary beneficiaries." There was a brief pause as the meaning settled. Daniel's brow furrowed slightly, his understanding catching up piece by piece. "You mean," he began, then stopped, the realization forming fully. Olivia's expression changed again, this time more subtly, but no less clearly. The certainty that had once driven her actions was gone, replaced by something quieter, something more controlled. "You already decided where it goes," she said. I nodded. Yes. Neither of them spoke immediately. There was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to reinterpret. The path forward had already been chosen, not in reaction to what had happened, but in anticipation of it. I reached for my coat, draped neatly over the back of the chair, and slipped it on with unhurried ease. Daniel watched me, his expression thoughtful, as if he were trying to understand something that could no longer be explained in simple terms. "Are you leaving?" he asked. I adjusted the sleeves slightly, smoothing the fabric before answering. "For a while," I said. It was not an escape. It was simply the next step. Olivia remained still, her gaze steady, her silence now fully intentional. She understood. Not just what had happened, but why. I moved toward the door, my steps quiet, my posture steady, the house behind me no longer something I needed to hold together. At the threshold, I paused briefly, not to look back, but to allow the moment to settle fully into place. Then I spoke, my voice calm, clear, carrying just enough weight to remain long after I was gone. "You wanted everything," I said. "Now you understand what that really means." And with that I stepped outside, the door closing softly behind me, leaving the silence exactly where it belonged.